Hello there, and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin our journey together, take a moment to get comfortable wherever you are. Let your weight settle into whatever surface is holding you. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom where the day has finally released you. A cozy corner where you can finally let your thoughts slow down. Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to explore Göbekli Tepe, a place in southeastern Turkey that has quietly rewritten everything we thought we knew about our ancestors. We'll discover massive stone pillars carved 11,000 years ago, understand why this temple was built before cities or farming existed, and contemplate what it means that our distant ancestors gathered to create something sacred before they learned to grow their own food. It's a journey that spans the very beginning of human civilization, touching on archaeology, ancient religion, and the question of what makes us human. But don't worry. This isn't going to be a frantic race through archaeological discoveries or a sensational mystery filled with wild theories. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the quiet work of excavation, the patient piecing together of ancient lives, and the wonder of standing in the presence of something built when the world was utterly different. By the end, I think you'll find yourself contemplating our shared human past with a sense of peaceful connection. If you enjoy these calm explorations of ancient places and forgotten peoples, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here, for making this community of curious minds seeking rest. So settle in, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, take a slow breath, and let it out even slower. And let's begin our slow drift through 11,000 years, back to a hilltop in Anatolia where people like us, but living lives we can barely imagine, built the world's first temple. There's nowhere you need to be right now. Nothing you need to do. Just listen, and let the story unfold around you like the soft earth that buried these stones for so long. In the autumn of 1963, a shepherd walked across a low hill in southeastern Turkey, following his flock as shepherds had done for thousands of years in that same landscape. The hill was called Göbekli Tepe, which translates simply to Potbelly Hill, a name that described its gently rounded shape rising from the plains. It was unremarkable land, covered in dry grass and scattered stones, the kind of place a person might pass 100 times without truly seeing it. But on this particular day, the shepherd noticed something unusual. Among the ordinary rocks that dotted the hillside, there were stones that seemed deliberately shaped. One piece, protruding from the earth, had a smooth surface and what looked like intentional carving. It was different from the natural limestone that formed the hill itself. The shepherd, whose name has been lost to history, did what people often do when they find something curious. He mentioned it to others. He spoke of the strange stones on Potbelly Hill. The information eventually reached academic circles, though it would take time. In those years, the region wasn't considered particularly significant archaeologically. The prevailing understanding of human history placed the origins of civilization farther south, in Mesopotamia, along the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Turkey's southeastern plateau, while certainly inhabited in ancient times, was thought to be peripheral to the main story of how humans developed agriculture, cities, and complex societies. A brief survey was conducted in the 1960s by researchers from Istanbul and Chicago. They examined the hill, noted the presence of worked stones, and made an assessment that would delay serious excavation for decades. The site, they concluded, was probably Byzantine, perhaps a medieval cemetery. The rounded stones might be the remains of gravestones worn smooth by centuries of weather. It was catalogued, noted in records, and largely forgotten by the academic world. The shepherd's discovery settled back into quiet obscurity. The stones continued to emerge slowly from the soil as rain and wind eroded the hilltop. Seasons passed. The political and social landscape of Turkey shifted and changed. Wars came and went. The field of archaeology advanced with new technologies and new questions. And all the while, beneath that unassuming hill, beneath centuries of accumulated soil and debris, Something extraordinary waited in darkness. Massive pillars stood in circles, their carved surfaces hidden from the sun they hadn't seen in thousands of years, their purpose and meaning preserved in stone but lost to human memory. It would take another person, another shepherd of sorts, to recognize what was really there. But that recognition was still 3 decades away. For now, in the quiet of the 1960s and 70s and 80s, Göbekli Tepe kept its secrets. The hill continued its patient existence, holding within itself a revelation that would transform our understanding of who our ancestors were and what they were capable of achieving. And that transformation, when it came, would begin with one person willing to see what others had missed. What does it mean for something to be buried for 11,000 years? Let's contemplate that span of time, not rushing through it, but letting it settle into our understanding slowly. 11,000 years ago, the last ice age was only recently ended. The great glaciers that had covered much of the northern hemisphere were in retreat, though their meltwater was still reshaping coastlines and river valleys. The world was warming, becoming the climate we recognize today, and that warming was creating new possibilities for human communities. The people living in southeastern Anatolia during this period were hunter-gatherers. They did not plant crops or tend fields. They had no domesticated animals beyond perhaps the dog, that ancient companion of human camps. They lived by knowing the land intimately, understanding which plants were edible and when they fruited, tracking the movements of gazelle and wild cattle and boar through the seasons. Their lives were mobile, following resources across a landscape that was far greener than the semi-arid plain we see today. These communities were small, probably consisting of extended family groups that might number a few dozen individuals. They made tools from flint, carefully knapping stone into scrapers, blades, and points. They processed hides into leather, gathered wild grains to grind between stones, and collected nuts and fruits according to the rhythm of seasons. By all conventional understanding of human development, these were people at the beginning of a long journey towards civilization. They were living the lifestyle that humans had lived for hundreds of thousands of years, and yet these people built Göbekli Tepe. They quarried limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons. They carved intricate images into stone using tools of flint and bone. They organized labor on a scale that required coordination among multiple communities. They created architecture that would not be matched in complexity for thousands of years. And then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, they carefully buried everything they had built. The burial was deliberate and thorough. This wasn't the gradual accumulation of windblown soil or the slow erosion of structures falling into ruin. Archaeological evidence shows that the people of Göbekli Tepe filled in their stone circles with debris, carefully packing earth and smaller stones around the pillars. They took structures that had stood open to the sky, places where they had gathered and performed rituals we can only imagine, and they entombed them completely. They transformed active sacred spaces into hidden monuments. And then they walked away. Layer upon layer, century upon century, the soil accumulated above these buried circles. Wind carried dust from distant places. Rain washed sediment down the hill slopes. Plants grew and died and became soil themselves. Small animals burrowed and nested. Humans continued to visit the area, leaving traces of their presence, adding their own thin layers to the hill's growing height. The Bronze Age came and went. The Iron Age civilizations rose and fell. The Persian Empire spread across these lands, then Alexander's armies, then Rome, then Byzantium, then the Islamic empires. Crusaders passed through this region. The Ottoman Empire rose and endured for centuries. And through all of this time, through all of these human stories and struggles and achievements, the stone circles of Göbekli Tepe remained hidden. The people who built them were forgotten. Their reasons for building, their beliefs, their very existence as a society capable of such achievement, all of this faded from human memory. The site became a hill, just a hill, one of many hills in a landscape full of them. Which brings us gently to the question of how anything so deliberately hidden could ever be found again. In 1994, Klaus Schmidt arrived at Göbekli Tepe. Schmidt was a German archaeologist working for the German Archaeological Institute, and he had spent years studying the prehistory of the Near East. He was familiar with the 1960s survey of the site and its conclusion that the hill contained a Byzantine cemetery. But Schmidt, looking at the survey notes and the few photographs that existed, had a different suspicion. Something about the described stones didn't fit the Byzantine pattern. When Schmidt first walked the site, he immediately recognized that the earlier assessment had been wrong. The stones emerging from the surface weren't Byzantine grave markers. They were prehistoric, and they were enormous. Here, protruding from the earth like the prow of a buried ship, was a carved limestone pillar. There, barely visible, were signs of additional structures beneath the surface. Schmidt understood in that moment of first recognition that he was looking at something extraordinary. What convinced Schmidt of the site's importance wasn't just the size of the stones, though that was impressive enough. It was the combination of factors that didn't make sense according to everything archaeologists thought they knew about human development. The location was wrong. This wasn't a river valley with rich alluvial soil for farming. It was an upland plateau, better suited for grazing than agriculture. The style was wrong. These T-shaped pillars didn't match any known architectural tradition from the region's later periods. But most importantly, the timing appeared to be wrong. The stones showed signs of extreme age. The tool marks, the weathering patterns, the archaeological deposits around them, all suggested a date far earlier than made sense for such sophisticated construction. Schmidt began to form a hypothesis that seemed almost impossible. These stones might predate agriculture itself. They might represent a monument built by hunter-gatherers, a possibility that contradicted the fundamental narrative of how civilization developed. According to the standard model which every archaeology student learned, the progression was clear. First came agriculture, as humans domesticated plants and animals. Agriculture created food surpluses. Surpluses allowed some people to specialize in tasks other than food production. Specialists included craftspeople, leaders, and religious figures. This specialization led to social hierarchies and organized religion. And organized religion eventually led to the construction of temples and monuments. The sequence was logical, well documented, and supported by evidence from sites across the world. Agriculture first, then complexity, then monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe, if Schmidt's initial assessment was correct, turned this sequence upside down. Here was monumental architecture, clearly requiring organized labor and social complexity, apparently built before agriculture existed. The implications were staggering, if these stones really were as old as they seemed. They represented something unprecedented. They suggested that human communities were capable of complex social organization and monumental construction before settling into agricultural villages. They hinted that perhaps the story of civilization didn't begin with farming, but with something else, something intangible, something spiritual. Schmidt must have stood on that hill, looking at the stones emerging from the soil, feeling the weight of what he might have found. He was an experienced archaeologist, trained to be skeptical, to verify before claiming, to let evidence build gradually rather than rush into conclusions. But he also understood that sometimes, rarely, a discovery comes along that changes everything, and he suspected strongly that this might be one of those times. What he needed now was to excavate carefully and methodically, to expose what lay beneath the surface, and to test his extraordinary hypothesis with the patient work of archaeology. The excavation at Göbekli Tepe officially began in 1995, and it would continue season after season for the next 2 decades of Schmidt's life. Archaeological excavation is painstaking work, requiring patience that most people find difficult to imagine. It's not the adventure depicted in films with treasures revealed in sudden dramatic moments. It's slow, careful removal of soil, measuring and photographing and documenting every layer, every object, every change in the Earth's colour or texture that might indicate human activity. Schmidt assembled a team of archaeologists, specialists and local workers. They established protocols for excavation, ensuring that no information would be lost in the process of uncovering what lay beneath. They set up systems for cataloguing finds, processing samples, and preserving exposed stonework. And then they began to dig, removing the accumulated soil of millennia in controlled sections, exposing layer by layer what human hands had built and then buried so long ago. What emerged from the earth was astonishing. The first complete stone circle to be excavated contained massive T-shaped pillars arranged in a rough oval. Each pillar stood between 3 and 4 meters tall, carved from single blocks of limestone. The stone was local, quarried from bedrock outcrops visible on the hillside, but the labour required to extract, shape and transport these monoliths was immense. 20 tons of stone, moved without wheels, without draft animals, using only human muscle and ingenuity, wooden levers perhaps, rope woven from plant fibres, log rollers, ramps of earth, methods we can guess at but can never fully reconstruct. The pillars weren't crude monoliths. They were carefully shaped, with human-like features suggested in their form. The T-shape itself resembled a stylized human figure, with the horizontal top representing shoulders and the vertical shaft representing the body. Some pillars had arms carved in relief along their sides, bent at the elbows with hands meeting at the pillar's front, as if these stone giants were standing in eternal attendance at some ceremony we can no longer witness. The carving was sophisticated, showing an understanding of stoneworking techniques that seemed impossibly advanced for the period. Between the large central pillars, the circles contained smaller pillars and stone benches. The floors were made of terrazzo, a technique involving limestone chips set in a binding matrix and then polished smooth. This flooring required knowledge of chemical processes, understanding how lime plaster sets and hardens. It required aesthetic sensibility, caring how the finished floor looked and felt. These were not people simply erecting functional structures. They were creating spaces that mattered aesthetically as well as practically. As excavation continued, more circles emerged. Each was unique in its details but shared the same basic plan. Large central pillars, smaller perimeter pillars, enclosing walls, terrazzo floors. The site revealed itself to contain not one stone circle, but many, perhaps dozens, though only a fraction of the hill has been excavated even now. Ground-penetrating radar suggests that much more remains beneath the surface, waiting for future archaeologists to uncover. Schmidt worked at the site almost continuously for the rest of his life. Every summer, he returned to that Turkish hilltop, directing excavations, analysing finds, refining his understanding of what this place had been. He became the public face of Göbekli Tepe, writing papers, giving lectures, explaining to the world what was emerging from the earth. He defended his dating of the site against skeptics, accumulated more evidence, built a case for his revolutionary interpretation. The man who had arrived at Göbekli Tepe with a suspicion had become the archaeologist who could prove that suspicion correct. And what he proved was genuinely revolutionary, a discovery that would require archaeologists and anthropologists everywhere to reconsider assumptions about human development that had seemed unquestionable. But before we can fully appreciate what Schmidt discovered, we need to understand how he knew when this place was built, and that question of dating takes us into the precise science of reading time in stone and soil. How do you determine the age of stones that contain no organic material to carbon date? This was the first challenge Schmidt faced in proving Göbekli Tepe's extraordinary antiquity. The pillars themselves, being stone, couldn't be directly dated using conventional radiocarbon methods. Stone doesn't contain carbon in a form that allows dating. A limestone pillar could have been carved yesterday or 10,000 years ago, and the stone itself won't reveal which is true. What archaeologists date instead are the organic materials associated with the construction and use of the site. seeds and charcoal from fires, bone from animals consumed during gatherings, plant remains trapped in mortar or flooring. These organic materials contain carbon, including the radioactive isotope carbon-14, which decays at a known rate. By measuring how much carbon-14 remains in a sample compared to stable carbon isotopes, scientists can calculate when the plant or animal the carbon came from died. The radiocarbon dates from Göbekli Tepe were consistent and shocking. Organic material from the oldest layers of construction and use dated to approximately 9,500 BCE, or roughly 11,500 years before present. This placed the site's construction in the pre-Pottery Neolithic period, a time when humans in this region were still hunter-gatherers, or at most at the very beginning of experimenting with cultivating wild plants. To put this in perspective, the construction of Göbekli Tepe predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It predates the invention of pottery in this region by 1,000 years or more. When the first stones were raised at Göbekli Tepe, humans had not yet domesticated sheep or goats, had not begun to plant wheat or barley in deliberate fields, had not created permanent villages with houses meant to stand for generations. The dates were verified and re-verified, multiple samples, multiple labs, consistent results. Schmidt's hypothesis was confirmed. Göbekli Tepe was built during the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic period, at the very dawn of what we call civilization. It was, without question, the oldest known monumental architecture in the world. Not just old, but the oldest, standing at the threshold of human history, marking a moment when our ancestors made a decision to create something permanent, something sacred, something that would outlast their individual lives. But dating the construction was only part of understanding the site. Schmidt and his team also discovered something equally important. The stone circles hadn't been abandoned and left to decay naturally. They had been deliberately buried, and the burial itself could be dated. The fill material covering the circles contained organic material that dated to centuries or even a millennium after the circle's construction. This meant that Göbekli Tepe was used for a significant period, perhaps 1,000 years or more, before being intentionally decommissioned and hidden. Why would people carefully bury their own monument? This question opens into mystery, into the realm where archaeological evidence can tell us what happened but not why. We know they buried it. We can see the deliberate nature of the burial in how thoroughly the circles were filled, how carefully the spaces around pillars were packed with rubble and soil. But the motivation, the belief system that led to this decision, remains opaque. Perhaps new religious ideas replaced the old. Perhaps the site's purpose was fulfilled. Perhaps something changed in how these people understood the sacred, making the old temple inappropriate or dangerous to leave exposed. What we're left with is paradox. A monument built to last millennia, created with extraordinary effort, used for generations, and then deliberately hidden from view. A place that mattered enough to require the labour of hundreds or thousands of people to construct, and then mattered enough in a different way to require similar effort to conceal. This paradox of creation and burial, of building and hiding, sits at the heart of Göbekli Tepe's mystery. And understanding what people created, in all its detail and complexity, becomes the next part of our journey into this ancient place. Stand, if you will, in the centre of one of Göbekli Tepe's stone circles, and imagine what you would see. Around you rise the T-shaped pillars, their limestone surfaces pale against the sky. The central pillars are the tallest, reaching perhaps 5 meters in height if you include the portion that extends below ground level. They stand facing each other across the circular space, like eternal sentinels, their T-shaped tops suggesting broad shoulders and heads. Along their surfaces you can see the marks where stone tools shaped them, the patient work of hands that have been dust for 11,000 years. These central pillars are the heart of each circle, and there's something almost human about them. The T-shape itself invites anthropomorphic interpretation. The horizontal top becomes shoulders, the vertical shaft becomes a body, and once you see them as stylized human figures, you begin to notice other details that reinforce this reading. Some pillars have arms carved in low relief, extending from the _1_ down the sides of the shaft. The arms are bent, with hands meeting at what would be the figure's front, fingers splayed across the stone belly. It's a pose of attention, perhaps, or of participation in some ritual act. But these aren't crude stick figures. The carving shows sophisticated understanding of three-dimensional form and human anatomy. The arms have proper proportions. The hands, when present, show individual fingers with careful detail. Some pillars also have belts carved around their midpoints, again suggesting these are meant to represent clothed human forms rather than abstract symbols. The belts sometimes include details like buckles or decorative elements, suggesting that the people who created these pillars thought carefully about how the figures they were creating should be dressed. Not all pillars have these anthropomorphic features. Some are plainer, simple T-shapes, without the carved arms and hands. This variation might indicate different roles within the circle, different meanings assigned to different pillars, or it might reflect different construction periods, with techniques and styles evolving over the centuries the site was in use. Archaeology rarely offers simple answers, and Göbekli Tepe is particularly generous with its mysteries. Around these central pillars, smaller pillars form the perimeter of the circle. These are still substantial stones, 2 to 3 meters tall but dwarfed by the central pair. They stand at intervals, creating an enclosing wall that defines the sacred space. Between the pillars, stone walls fill the gaps, creating a continuous barrier between the inside of the circle and the outside world. The message is clear. This space is separate, set apart, distinct from ordinary life. To enter this space is to cross a threshold into somewhere different. The floors inside the circles are made with care. Limestone chips were set in a lime mortar matrix and then polished smooth, creating a terrazzo surface that would have gleamed when new. Creating such a floor requires knowledge and skill. You need to know how to burn limestone to create quicklime, how to mix that lime with water and aggregates to create a workable mortar, how to lay and polish the surface to achieve a smooth finish. These are not skills that appear spontaneously. They represent accumulated knowledge, probably passed down through generations, refined through practice. Everything about these stone circles speaks of intentionality and care. These were not structures thrown up quickly to serve an immediate need. They were built to last, built with attention to detail, built to be impressive and meaningful. The people who created them invested enormous resources of time and labour, and they did so for reasons that mattered deeply to them. Which leads us naturally to wonder, what else did they carve into these stones? What images and symbols did they consider important enough to preserve in stone? The circular plan of Göbekli Tepe's structures is significant in ways that extend beyond simple geometry. Circles are unusual in monumental architecture, especially prehistoric architecture. Humans building permanent structures tend to favour right angles, creating rectangular rooms and orthogonal layouts that are easier to construct and use efficiently. A circular building is more complex to plan and execute, requiring careful measurement and coordination to achieve a true curve. Yet at Göbekli Tepe, the builders chose circles, and they repeated this choice across multiple structures over centuries. This suggests that the circular form itself carried meaning. Circles are enclosed, protected, equal at all points from the centre. They create a space where people can gather facing inward, where everyone has equal access to the centre and equal status within the structure. This is the geometry of communal gathering, of shared experience, of rituals performed in common. Each circle at Göbekli Tepe follows a similar plan, but no two are identical. The largest circles excavated so far measure about 20 to 30 metres in diameter. Smaller ones might be 10 to 15 metres across. The number of perimeter pillars varies, but typically ranges from 8 to 12. The central pillars, always a pair, stand slightly offset from the geometric centre, creating a subtle asymmetry that might have been significant to the builder's understanding of the space. The orientation of the circles shows patterns that suggest astronomical awareness. Many of the central pillars are aligned roughly north-south, though not precisely so. Some researchers have proposed that certain structures align with the rising or setting points of significant celestial bodies, though this remains a topic of scholarly debate. What seems clear is that the builders were attentive to direction and orientation, incorporating these concerns into their designs in ways that mattered to them. Between the circles, excavation has revealed other features: stone-lined pits, their purpose uncertain; possible post holes suggesting temporary structures, perhaps canopies or screens used during ceremonies; concentrations of animal bones, particularly from gazelles and wild cattle, speaking to feasting and ritual consumption. The site wasn't just the stone circles themselves, but a complex of activities and structures, some permanent and some ephemeral, all oriented around the sacred purposes the site served. One remarkable feature of Göbekli Tepe's architecture is what's missing. There are no houses, no domestic structures, no evidence of permanent habitation. The stone circles stand alone, without the surrounding village that archaeologists would normally expect at a site requiring such intensive construction and use. This absence tells its own story. Göbekli Tepe was not a place where people lived. It was a place where people came, perhaps from considerable distances, to participate in whatever activities the site accommodated. This pattern, pilgrimage to a central sacred site, is known from many later cultures, but finding it at such an early date, among people who are hunter-gatherers or at most early farmers, is extraordinary. It suggests a level of social organisation and shared belief that extends beyond individual communities. People from different groups, perhaps speaking different dialects or languages, following different bands across the landscape for most of the year, came together at this one place. They coordinated their efforts to build and maintain the stone circles. They shared in rituals and feasts. They created, collectively, something larger than any single community could have achieved. The stone circles of Göbekli Tepe represent more than just architectural achievement. They represent the human capacity for cooperation, for shared purpose, for creating meaning through collective effort. And they represent this capacity at a moment in human history when we thought such things weren't yet possible. Which brings us to consider what these ancient builders carved into their stones, and what those carvings might reveal about how they saw the world. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are covered with carvings, and these carvings are among the most remarkable aspects of the entire site. They depict animals, hundreds of them, rendered in relief with varying degrees of detail and skill. The bestiary carved into these stones gives us a glimpse into the natural world as the builders of Göbekli Tepe experienced it, and into which creatures held significance in their belief system. Lions appear frequently, shown in profile with characteristic manes and powerful bodies. These are not the cartoon figures a child might draw, but anatomically aware representations created by people who had observed lions closely, who knew how these predators moved and hunted. Foxes or jackals slink across the stone, their bushy tails and pointed ears carefully rendered. Wild boars charge forward, bristles raised, tusks prominent. Snakes wind around pillars and across horizontal surfaces, their scaled bodies rendered with particular care. Birds are everywhere at Göbekli Tepe. Vultures with distinctive wing shapes, cranes with long necks extended, waterfowl that might be ducks or geese. The bird images are often large and prominent, sometimes covering entire faces of pillars. One particularly striking pillar shows a vulture with wings spread wide, positioned as if descending toward the earth. Some researchers have interpreted this as a representation of excarnation, the practice of exposing human corpses to scavenging birds to strip the flesh before bones are buried. Such practices are known from later cultures in the region, and the prominence of vulture imagery at Göbekli Tepe might indicate similar beliefs about death and the disposal of the dead. Insects and arthropods also appear. Spiders with careful attention to the number and arrangement of legs, Scorpions with their curved tails and prominent pincers, even what appear to be ants or beetles, tiny compared to the larger animals but rendered with the same care for detail. The inclusion of these smaller creatures suggests that the carvers were interested in representing the full spectrum of life they encountered, not just the impressive megafauna. More mysterious are the abstract symbols that appear alongside the animal carvings: H-shaped symbols, V-shapes, crescents, and other geometric forms whose meaning we can only guess at. These might represent concepts rather than physical objects. They might be numbers or calendrical notations. They might be clan symbols or territorial markers, or they might mean something completely different, something that made perfect sense to the people who carved them, but which we, separated by 11,000 years and a complete cultural gulf, cannot hope to fully understand. What's particularly interesting is the absence of certain animals from the carved bestiary. No dogs, despite the fact that dogs were probably domesticated or at least associated with humans by this period. No humans, with the possible exception of the anthropomorphic pillars themselves. The carvings focus on wild animals, creatures of the landscape that humans hunted or avoided or observed. This choice suggests that the carvings served a specific purpose related to humanity's relationship with the natural world and the animals they shared it with. The technical skill required to create these carvings is considerable. The carvers worked with flint tools, harder than limestone but still requiring patience and precision to shape stone. They understood negative space and relief carving, knowing how to remove stone to create the illusion of three-dimensional form. They had aesthetic judgment, deciding which animals to depict, where to place them on the pillars, how large to make them. This was art, not just craft, and it was art created in service of belief. Looking at these carved animals now, across the gulf of millennia, we feel a connection to the people who made them. They saw the same species we can still see in the region, though some are now extinct or extirpated. They paid attention to the natural world with a close observation born of dependence on it, and they chose to preserve that world in stone, creating images that would outlast their own lives by thousands of years. These carvings are messages from the deep past, speaking to us not in words, but in the universal language of shared observation of the natural world. Let's contemplate for a moment what it actually required to build Göbekli Tepe. Not the spiritual or intellectual requirements, but the simple physical labour. This perspective helps us understand the level of social organisation these communities had achieved and the importance they placed on this project. Begin with the quarrying. The limestone used for the pillars came from bedrock outcrops on and near the site. Quarrying stone without metal tools means using stone on stone, exploiting natural weaknesses in the rock, creating fracture lines through patient pounding, and the use of wooden wedges that expand when wetted. A single large pillar might weigh 20 tons. That's the weight of several elephants or a dozen automobiles. Moving such a weight requires mechanical advantage, human muscle, and coordination. The builders probably used wooden levers as first-class levers, with fulcrums positioned to lift one end of the stone. They might have used log rollers, placing round wooden poles beneath the stone and rolling it forward, constantly moving rollers from the back to the front as the stone advanced. They might have built earthen ramps to facilitate moving stones from lower quarries to higher ground. How many people does it take to move 20 tons? If we assume that a strong person can pull or push with a force equivalent to their own body weight, and average body weights of perhaps 60 to 70 kilograms, you would need coordinated effort from dozens of people simultaneously. Perhaps 50 people, perhaps 100, all pulling together, all coordinating their movements, all working under direction to achieve the common goal. This isn't something a single family group can do. This requires multiple communities working together. Shaping the pillars required different skills and different scales of labour. Flint tools in skilled hands can work limestone effectively, but the process is slow. Creating the smooth surfaces of the T-shaped pillars, achieving the regular forms and right angles, would have required days or weeks of patient work per pillar. This was likely work for specialists. people who had developed the skill through practice, who understood stone and how to shape it. The presence of specialists implies surplus food production, sufficient to support people who weren't spending their days hunting and gathering. Carving the animal reliefs adds another layer of labour and skill. These aren't rough sketches but detailed representations. The carver had to envision the final form, mark out the design on the stone, and then carefully remove material to create the relief. This is artistic work, requiring not just technical skill, but aesthetic judgment. Some carvings show sophisticated understanding of perspective and anatomy. Others are more schematic. The variation might represent different carvers' skill levels, or different purposes for different carvings, or evolution in style over time. Erecting the pillars in their final positions would have been one of the most dramatic moments in the construction process. Imagine it, the massive T-shaped stone, finished and carved, being manoeuvred into position. Pits dug precisely to receive the pillar's base. Ropes attached, people assembled, coordinated effort to raise the stone vertical. The moment when it settles into place and stands on its own for the first time. The achievement, the sense of accomplishment, the realization of something imagined now made permanent in stone. Creating the terrazzo floors required different knowledge. Someone had to understand how to burn limestone to create quicklime, how to slake it with water, how to mix it with aggregates to create mortar. This is chemistry, even if the practitioners didn't think of it in those terms. It's understanding cause and effect, recognizing that certain processes produce useful materials. The knowledge to create lime mortar is not instinctive. It must be discovered, tested, refined, and passed on through teaching and demonstration. We can estimate roughly that building one stone circle might require several thousand person days of labour. If a community of 50 people worked on it seasonally, perhaps for a month or two each year between the demands of obtaining food, it might take several years to complete one circle. Göbekli Tepe contains multiple circles, built over centuries. The total labour investment is staggering, representing perhaps tens of thousands of person days of work across generations. And all of this effort, all of this coordination and skill and time, was invested not in building houses or granaries or defensive walls, but in creating a sacred space. This tells us something profound about what mattered to these people, about where they chose to invest their collective resources. One of the most significant discoveries at Göbekli Tepe is what archaeologists haven't found. The site has been excavated carefully, with attention to recovering evidence of all human activities, and yet certain categories of artifacts and features that archaeologists normally associate with settled agricultural communities are conspicuously absent or minimal. Understanding what's missing helps us grasp how remarkable Göbekli Tepe truly is. There are no houses at Göbekli Tepe, no domestic structures with hearths and sleeping areas and storage facilities, no trash pits filled with the debris of daily life, no accumulation of broken tools and worn-out objects that mark places where people lived year-round. The stone circles stand without the surrounding settlement that would normally support a construction project of this magnitude. This absence is so striking that it fundamentally shapes how archaeologists interpret the site. If people weren't living at Göbekli Tepe, they were visiting it. This makes the site a centre of pilgrimage rather than habitation, a place people came to for specific purposes and then left. The model that emerges is of seasonal gatherings, perhaps timed to particular celestial events or times of resource abundance. Communities from across the region would converge at this one location, bringing food and tools and labour, participating in whatever rituals the site accommodated, and then dispersing back to their respective territories. The earliest layers at Göbekli Tepe contain no pottery. Pottery is one of the diagnostic markers of the Neolithic Revolution. It appears when people settle down, need containers for storage, and have the stable fire facilities to produce ceramic vessels. The absence of pottery at Göbekli Tepe's founding layers confirms that the site was built before this technology was adopted in the region. Later layers do contain some pottery, indicating that the site continued to be used as ceramic technology spread, but the fundamental construction predates this development. Similarly, there's limited evidence of cultivated grains in the earliest levels. The plant remains recovered from Göbekli Tepe include wild species, gathered rather than farmed. This doesn't mean the builders had no knowledge of edible plants or weren't beginning to understand plant cycles and propagation. But it does mean they weren't yet committed farmers, settled in one place and dependent on crops they planted and harvested. What there is evidence of, abundantly, is feasting. Animal bones accumulate at Göbekli Tepe in quantities that suggest large-scale consumption of meat. Gazelles, wild cattle, boar and other game animals were brought to the site, butchered, cooked and eaten. The feasting was communal, bringing together people who had cooperated in the hunt and the building of the site. Sharing meat creates social bonds, establishes reciprocity, reinforces group identity. The feasts at Göbekli Tepe were probably central to the site's purpose, combining the practical function of feeding workers with the social and spiritual functions of communal ritual. This pattern, monumental architecture without settled agriculture, represents a challenge to the traditional narrative of civilization's development. The old story went, agriculture creates surplus, surplus creates hierarchy and specialization, specialization allows for monumental building. But Göbekli Tepe suggests a different sequence. Perhaps the gathering and feasting and ritual come first, creating the social structures and cooperative frameworks that then make agriculture possible and attractive. Some archaeologists now propose that Göbekli Tepe and similar sites might have been catalysts for agricultural development, rather than consequences of it. The need to feed large gatherings of people at specific times might have encouraged experimentation with managing plant and animal populations. The seasonal return to a particular location might have created opportunities to observe plant cycles and experiment with propagation. The social connections formed through gathering and ritual might have facilitated the exchange of knowledge about effective cultivation techniques. This is speculative, of course. We're interpreting fragmentary evidence, trying to reconstruct not just behaviours, but the thoughts and decisions that drove those behaviours. But the evidence does support a picture of Göbekli Tepe as something unprecedented, a place where hunter-gatherers invested enormous effort into creating something permanent and sacred before they had committed to the agricultural lifestyle that would eventually transform human existence. And understanding who these builders were, how they lived, and what they believed becomes the next part of our slow journey through this ancient place. Who were the people who built Göbekli Tepe? Not in terms of names or specific identities, which are lost forever, but in terms of their way of life, their capabilities, their relationship to the landscape they inhabited. Let's build a picture of them slowly, from the evidence archaeology provides. They were anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, with brains and bodies identical to ours. Any baby from their time, transported to our present and raised in our culture, would be indistinguishable from any other modern human. The difference isn't in biology, but in knowledge, technology, and culture. These people lived in a world still emerging from the last ice age. The glaciers had retreated, but their influence persisted in the form of seasonal meltwater, altered drainage patterns and ecosystems in flux. The southeastern Anatolian landscape they inhabited was different from today's semi-arid plateau. It was greener, with more forest cover, more reliable water sources, and abundant game. Archaeological and paleo-environmental studies suggest a landscape of open woodland and grassland, rich in plant and animal resources. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle often brings to mind images of scarcity, of people constantly moving in search of food, of hand-to-mouth existence. But this picture doesn't match the evidence from Upper Paleolithic and early Neolithic societies in resource-rich environments. These were people who knew their landscape intimately, who understood seasonal patterns of plant growth and animal movement, who had sophisticated strategies for obtaining food. In productive environments like the ancient Fertile Crescent, hunter-gatherers could live well, with leisure time for activities beyond simple survival. They organised themselves in bands, probably consisting of extended family groups. A typical band might include 30 to 50 individuals, enough to provide labour for hunting and gathering, while remaining small enough to move efficiently and avoid depleting local resources. Bands were linked to other bands through kinship networks, marriage exchanges and trade relationships. These larger social networks connecting multiple bands across a region created the framework for larger cooperative endeavours. Their technology, while lacking metal and many later innovations, was sophisticated within its parameters. They created pressure-flaked flint tools of remarkable delicacy and efficiency, blades that could slice hide or process plant materials, points for spears and possibly arrows, scrapers for working leather, burins for carving bone and wood. Each tool type represents accumulated knowledge about stone and its properties, understanding of fracture mechanics, and skilled hand-eye coordination developed through years of practice. They processed hides into leather for clothing, bags, and shelter. They probably made cordage from plant fibres, essential for creating nets, snares, and bindings. They knew which woods made the best tool handles, which plants were edible and when they fruited, which roots could be processed to remove toxins and become food sources. This knowledge was encyclopedic, passed down through generations, refined through observation and experimentation. Language capability was certainly present and probably sophisticated. Coordinating the construction of Göbekli Tepe would require complex communication. Planning a hunt for large game requires discussion of strategy, assignment of roles, ability to convey spatial information about terrain and animal behaviour. Creating and maintaining the social networks that brought multiple communities together for collective building projects requires narrative ability, persuasion, and shared conceptual frameworks. They had art, as the carvings at Göbekli Tepe demonstrate. But beyond the stone carvings, which survived because of their medium, they probably had art in many perishable forms: body painting, feather arrangements, carved wooden objects, songs and stories, dance and ritual performance. We see only the durable fraction of their cultural production, the stone that survives millennia. Everything else, potentially the majority of their artistic and cultural expression, has vanished without trace. What emerges from this consideration is a picture of capable, intelligent people living in a productive environment, possessing both the practical skills to thrive and the cognitive and social capacities to create something as remarkable as Göbekli Tepe. They were not primitive in the sense of simple or crude. They were sophisticated practitioners of a lifestyle that humans had refined over hundreds of thousands of years, and they were at a moment of transformation, beginning to experiment with new ways of relating to the landscape and to each other. The relationship between Göbekli Tepe and the development of agriculture is one of the most fascinating questions the site raises. For decades, archaeologists believed that agriculture came first, creating the preconditions for monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe challenges this assumption by presenting monumental architecture before clear evidence of agriculture, but the relationship might be more nuanced than simple reversal of the traditional sequence. Let's explore this complexity gently. The Göbekli Tepe region, southeastern Anatolia, is part of the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia and the Levant to Egypt. This region is where many of the founder crops of Western agriculture were first domesticated. Wild emmer wheat, barley, lentils, chickpeas, all had wild ancestors growing naturally in this area. The climate and soil were suited to these plants' growth, and hunter-gatherers in the region had been harvesting wild grains for millennia before anyone thought to deliberately plant them. Genetic studies of modern wheat varieties have traced their ancestry back to wild emmer populations in this specific region. The wild grains growing on hillsides around Göbekli Tepe were the direct ancestors of crops that would eventually spread across the world, fundamentally transforming human existence. The people building Göbekli Tepe were living among the plants that would become agriculture's foundation. They were harvesting wild grains, grinding them into flour, possibly even beginning to favour certain varieties over others. The transition from harvesting wild plants to deliberately cultivating them is not a sharp line but a gradient. At what point does favouring certain gathering locations become management of those locations? When does scattering seeds in productive areas become planting? When does selectively harvesting plants with desirable traits become deliberate breeding? These questions don't have clear answers. The archaeological evidence shows gradual change over centuries, a slow accumulation of new practices and understandings. At Göbekli Tepe's earliest levels, the plant remains a primarily wild species. But as the site continues to be used through later periods, evidence for domesticated varieties appears. The timeline suggests that Göbekli Tepe was built just at the threshold of agricultural development, during the period when people were experimenting with cultivation, but before it became the dominant subsistence strategy. The site may have been part of the social and cultural context within which agriculture developed. Klaus, Schmidt and others have proposed that sites like Göbekli Tepe might have actually catalysed agricultural development. The hypothesis goes like this. Regularly gathering large numbers of people requires feeding them. Hunter-gatherer bands visiting Göbekli Tepe seasonally would need to bring food, or obtain it locally in quantities beyond what individual families required. This need might have encouraged experimentation with managing plant and animal populations to increase yields. The large-scale feasting evidenced at Göbekli Tepe required killing and processing many animals. Some researchers have suggested that the need to maintain game populations near the site might have led to early animal management practices, potentially contributing to the domestication of sheep and goats. The social structures developed to coordinate construction might have provided frameworks for coordinating agricultural labour. The seasonal gathering pattern might have influenced decisions about when to plant and harvest crops. This reverses the traditional causation. Instead of agriculture creating surplus that funds monument building, the monument creates demand that encourages agricultural development. It's an elegant hypothesis, though difficult to prove definitively. What we can say with certainty is that Göbekli Tepe and early agriculture emerged in the same place at roughly the same time, and it's unlikely this is mere coincidence. The two developments, monumental architecture and food production, were somehow connected, feeding back on each other in complex ways. There's something profound in this timing. Humans were changing their relationship with the natural world in multiple ways simultaneously. They were creating permanent monuments, investing in places rather than remaining mobile. They were beginning to manipulate plant and animal populations, moving from passive harvesting to active management. They were organising larger social groups for cooperative endeavours. All of these changes are interconnected, representing a fundamental shift in how humans existed in and understood their world. And Göbekli Tepe stands at this moment of transformation, a monument to the threshold between two ways of being human. What happened at Göbekli Tepe? What rituals were performed within those stone circles, beneath open sky, or perhaps under temporary canopies of wood and hide? This is where archaeology reaches its limits, where material evidence can tell us what existed but not what it meant or how it was used. We're left with informed speculation, building possibilities from fragments and comparisons. Let's explore these possibilities carefully, acknowledging the uncertainty inherent in interpreting ritual from physical remains. The stone circles themselves define ritual space. By creating an enclosure, the builders marked off a particular area as special, different from the surrounding landscape. To enter the circle would be to cross a boundary, to move from ordinary space into sacred space. This spatial separation is fundamental to ritual practice across cultures. The act of entering becomes meaningful in itself, a threshold crossing that prepares participants for what comes next. The scale of the circle suggests communal participation. These aren't tiny chapels for solitary contemplation, but large spaces capable of accommodating dozens or even hundreds of people simultaneously. The arrangement, with central pillars and surrounding space, creates a natural focus for attention, while allowing many people to observe or participate. This is architecture for group ritual, for shared experience, for communities coming together in collective action. The animal carvings on the pillars probably played a role in whatever rituals occurred. Perhaps they represented totemic beings, spiritual entities associated with different clans or communities. Perhaps they were objects of veneration themselves, carved gods or spirits demanding respect and offerings. Perhaps they served as mnemonic devices, prompts for storytelling or liturgical recitation, each animal representing a part of a larger narrative that explained the world's origins or humanity's place within it. The feasting that clearly occurred at Göbekli Tepe was likely ritualized. Communal meals are sacred occasions in many cultures, opportunities for sharing not just food but fellowship, for reinforcing social bonds and reciprocal obligations. The scale of feasting at Göbekli Tepe, with evidence of many animals being consumed during gathering periods, suggests celebrations or ceremonies that brought communities together in joyful communion. Breaking bread together or sharing roasted meat creates connection between participants. Some researchers have proposed astronomical functions for the site. The orientation of certain pillars and structures might align with celestial events, solstices or equinoxes, the rising of particular stars or constellations. Many ancient monuments worldwide incorporate astronomical alignments, reflecting humanity's long-standing fascination with the heavens and attempts to understand celestial patterns. If Göbekli Tepe did mark astronomical events, rituals might have been timed to these moments, gatherings coordinated with solar or lunar cycles. The presence of vulture imagery has led to speculation about funerary practices. Excarnation, the exposure of corpses to scavenging birds, is documented in later cultures in the region. If the builders of Göbekli Tepe practiced excarnation, the site might have served as a place for death rituals, for processing the transition from life to death, for honouring ancestors and maintaining connection with the dead. The prominence of vulture carvings supports this interpretation, though it remains unproven. Music and dance almost certainly featured in rituals. Humans make music. It's one of our universal cultural practices. The builders of Göbekli Tepe probably had drums made from stretched hide, flutes carved from bone or wood, rattles made from gourds or shells. They probably sang, voices raised together in chant or song. They probably danced, bodies moving in coordinated patterns, feet striking the terrazzo floors in rhythm. None of this survives archaeologically, but its absence from the record doesn't mean its absence from their lives. What's striking about contemplating Göbekli Tepe's rituals is how little we actually know, combined with how much we can reasonably infer. We know people gathered there. We know they built something impressive. We know they feasted. Beyond this, we enter the realm of possibility rather than certainty. But this uncertainty need not frustrate us. Instead, it can remind us that past peoples had inner lives as rich as ours, belief systems as complex as ours, and that much of human experience leaves no archaeological trace. The rituals at Göbekli Tepe mattered to the people who performed them, mattered enough to justify enormous effort, and that mattering persists even when the specific details are lost. Let's return to the carvings for a moment, but this time consider not what they depict but how they were made. The act of carving stone is intimate, requiring patience and attention that puts the carver in extended contact with their material and their subject. Understanding this process helps us appreciate the human dimension of Göbekli Tepe's creation. Imagine a person sitting before a limestone pillar, flint tools in hand, beginning the work of creating an animal in relief. The carver starts with an idea, a mental image of what they want to create. Perhaps they've seen this animal many times, observed it closely enough to hold its form in memory. Perhaps they're working from a tradition, following patterns they learned from more experienced carvers. They mark out the basic outline, scratching it into the stone surface with a pointed flint tool. This outline defines the space the carving will occupy and the rough form it will take. The actual removal of stone is done through pecking and scraping. The carver strikes the limestone with a harder stone, perhaps a flint hammerstone, creating small impact craters that slowly deepen the relief. They work methodically, removing material bit by bit, constantly checking their progress against the mental image they're working toward. This is not quick work. Creating even a simple carved image might require hours of continuous effort. Complex, detailed carvings might require days. As the relief deepens, the image begins to emerge from the stone. The carver can now see their vision taking three-dimensional form. They refine the details, working more carefully now, adding texture to represent fur or feathers, defining facial features, getting the proportions right. Different tools serve different purposes. Pointed flints for fine detail work, broader flints for removing larger areas of stone, abraders made from harder stone for smoothing and finishing surfaces. The carver makes choices constantly. How deep should the relief be? Which features are most important to capture? How should the animal be positioned on the pillar's surface? These are aesthetic decisions requiring judgment and skill. Not every carver will make the same choices, which is why we see variation in the carvings across the site. Some are more naturalistic, showing close observation of animal anatomy. Others are more stylized, capturing essential features while simplifying forms. The physical act of carving is demanding. Your hands grow tired from gripping tools and striking stone. Your eyes strain from focusing on fine details. Your back and shoulders ache from holding position. A person carving for hours a day would develop specific muscles, would show bone changes in their hands and arms that physical anthropologists can identify in skeletal remains. Carving left physical marks on the carvers themselves. But there's also something meditative about repetitive skilled work. The rhythm of striking stone, the gradual emergence of form from formlessness, the satisfaction of seeing your vision realized in permanent material. Carving can enter a flow state, where time passes unnoticed and the work becomes its own reward. The carvers at Göbekli Tepe might have found their work burdensome, or might have found it fulfilling. Probably they experienced both, as most craftspeople do. The choice of subjects reveals what mattered to the carvers and their communities. They carved animals they encountered in their environment, animals that were significant for subsistence or for symbolic reasons. They carved with attention to detail, suggesting respect for their subjects. They placed the carvings on pillars that would stand for generations, ensuring that their work would be seen by people they would never meet. This is creating for the future, for continuity, for legacy. Consider that some of the youngest carvings at Göbekli Tepe are still 11,000 years old. The person who carved a fox onto a pillar in that final phase of the site's use has been dead for 110 centuries. Everyone they knew is dead. The language they spoke is extinct and unrecorded. Their name, their personality, their joys and sorrows, all are lost absolutely. But their work remains. That fox they carved still exists, still shows the care they put into capturing its form. Through their carving, some tiny fragment of their existence persists, speaks to us across an otherwise unbridgeable gulf of time. One of the most significant insights about Göbekli Tepe comes from considering the logistics of its construction and use. The amount of labour required to build the site exceeded what any single hunter-gatherer band could provide. This means that multiple communities from different territories needed to cooperate in the site's creation and maintenance. Göbekli Tepe was a regional centre, a place where people from across the landscape came together, and understanding this helps us grasp the site's social significance. Hunter-gatherer bands are typically territorial, maintaining exclusive or preferential access to particular hunting and gathering ranges. This territoriality prevents over-exploitation of resources and reduces conflict over access to productive areas. But territories have boundaries, and beyond those boundaries live other bands. People related through kinship but maintaining some independence. The network of relationships between bands, through marriage exchange and occasional cooperation, creates larger social structures than the individual band. For multiple bands to cooperate on a project like Göbekli Tepe, there needed to be mechanisms for coordination and shared purpose. The site itself might have served as neutral ground, a place that belonged to all participating communities collectively rather than to any single group. The rituals performed there might have reinforced the connections between communities, creating shared identity and mutual obligations. Coming together to build and maintain the site was an act of community building at a regional scale. The feasting at Göbekli Tepe takes on new significance in this context. When representatives from multiple communities gather, sharing food becomes a political act as much as a practical one. Who provides the food, how it's distributed, who eats with whom, all of these details carry social meaning. The large-scale feasts at Göbekli Tepe were occasions for negotiating relationships, for displaying generosity, for creating reciprocal obligations that would bind communities together across time and distance. Trade probably occurred at these gatherings. People bringing materials from their territories, exchanging flint from good quarries, obsidian from volcanic sources, hides from successful hunts, preserved foods, decorative items. Trade creates interdependence, gives communities reasons to maintain peaceful relationships, spreads innovations and ideas. Göbekli Tepe might have been as much a trade centre as a ritual centre, though the two functions would have been deeply intertwined in ways we separate only artificially. Marriage exchanges probably occurred here. For small bands to avoid inbreeding, they need to exchange partners with other bands. These exchanges are often formalized, involving negotiations and rituals. Gatherings at Göbekli Tepe would have provided opportunities for young people from different communities to meet, for families to arrange marriages that would create kinship ties between bands, for the broader social network to be woven and maintained through these personal connections. Knowledge was shared at these gatherings. Successful hunting techniques, information about resource locations, warnings about dangers, stories and myths, technological innovations. In pre-literate societies, knowledge transmission requires face-to-face contact. Gatherings like those at Göbekli Tepe were opportunities for people to learn from each other, for best practices to spread across communities, for the collective wisdom of the region to be pooled and disseminated. The site's longevity, used over more than a millennium, suggests that it successfully fulfilled whatever purposes it served. Generations of people continue to invest effort in maintaining and adding to the structures. This continuity implies that the social and spiritual functions of the site remained relevant across centuries of social change. Even as the hunter-gatherer lifestyle began to give way to early farming and the first permanent villages began to appear in the region, Göbekli Tepe stands as evidence of large-scale cooperation among prehistoric communities, of people finding ways to work together toward shared goals despite the challenges of communication and coordination in a pre-literate society. It demonstrates that social complexity, the ability to organize beyond the immediate family group, predates the agricultural surplus that we once thought was its prerequisite. People came together to build Göbekli Tepe not because they had to, not because material necessity demanded it, but because they chose to, because they valued what the site represented and what gathering there meant to them. And understanding what they valued, what meaning they found in this place, brings us to questions of belief and spirituality that can only be approached with appropriate humility and care. The traditional narrative of human development follows a clear progression. First, agriculture. Farming creates reliable food surpluses, allowing some people to specialize in work other than food production. These specialists include priests, who develop formal religious institutions. Religious institutions build temples to house their practices and impress believers. The sequence makes logical sense. Practical needs drive innovation. Stability enables cultural development. Cultural development creates monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe reverses this sequence entirely. Here we have temples without agriculture, monuments without cities, sophisticated architecture without settled villages, the old narrative. comfortable and logical doesn't account for what the archaeological evidence shows. This inversion requires us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about what drives human cultural development and what motivates people to invest enormous effort in creating something permanent. One interpretation, proposed by Klaus, Schmidt and others, suggests that religion came first. Not religion in the sense of formalized institutions with priests and doctrines, but religion in the broader sense of shared cosmological beliefs, of understanding the world in terms that include spiritual or sacred dimensions, of recognizing some things as special or set apart. If humans first developed complex belief systems that required communal expression through ritual, those beliefs might have motivated the construction of ritual spaces. This perspective sees Göbekli Tepe as evidence that humans had sophisticated spiritual lives before they developed agriculture. The cognitive capacity for religious thought, for symbolic thinking, for understanding the world through metaphor and myth, these capabilities existed in fully modern form in hunter-gatherer populations. The evidence for art and ritual going back tens of thousands of years supports this view. What Göbekli Tepe adds is evidence that this spirituality could motivate large-scale construction projects. But there's another possibility worth considering. Perhaps the relationship between monument building and agricultural development isn't one causing the other, but both arising from shared social changes. The end of the Ice Age created new environmental conditions, new opportunities, new challenges. Human communities had to adapt to changing landscapes, shifting animal distributions, altered plant communities. These adaptations required new forms of social organization, new ways of coordinating activity beyond the immediate family band. Göbekli Tepe might represent an early solution to the problem of maintaining social cohesion across dispersed communities. By creating a central gathering place, by investing collective effort in its construction, by using it for rituals and feasts that brought people together, communities created the social infrastructure that would later support agricultural intensification and village life. The temple came first not because religion is more fundamental than food, but because social organization is prerequisite to economic transformation. There's also the possibility that we're asking the wrong question. We assume that building Göbekli Tepe required special justification, that monuments need explaining while ordinary life is self-evident. But perhaps for the people who built Göbekli Tepe, creating a place for gathering and ritual was as natural and necessary as making tools or building shelters. Perhaps their motivations weren't exceptional but normal expressions of human social and spiritual needs. What we can say with confidence is that the people who built Göbekli Tepe valued it enough to invest enormous effort in its creation. They valued it enough to return seasonally for centuries. They valued it enough to maintain and expand it across generations. This value suggests that the site fulfilled important needs, whether those needs were spiritual, social, economic, or some combination we can only partially reconstruct from material evidence. The question _quote_2_ may not have an answer that would satisfy us. The builders might not have thought of what they were creating as a temple, in the sense we use that word. They might have had motivations that don't translate into our conceptual categories. They were humans like us in biological terms, but living in a different world, with different assumptions, different priorities, different ways of understanding what matters. We can recognize their achievement without fully comprehending their motivations, can stand in awe of what they created while acknowledging the limits of our understanding. The story of Göbekli Tepe doesn't end with its use but with its burial. After centuries of gatherings and rituals, after generations of communities coming together to feast and build and maintain the stone circles, something changed. The people who used Göbekli Tepe decided to bury it, to fill in the stone circles, to cover the carved pillars, to end whatever purposes the site had served. This decision is as significant as the decision to build in the first place, and understanding it opens into deep mysteries of belief and cultural change. The burial was not abandonment. When people simply stop using a site, it decays naturally. Wooden elements rot, stones fall, Wind and rain erode exposed surfaces, vegetation reclaims the area. The process is gradual and passive, but at Göbekli Tepe, the evidence shows active burial. The stone circles were filled with rubble, small stones, earth, debris. The filling was deliberate and thorough, creating conditions that would preserve the structures rather than allowing them to decay. Why go to such effort? Why not simply walk away? Let the place fade back into the landscape through natural processes. The decision to bury required labour, required coordinating people to haul fill material and pack it around the pillars. It required care, ensuring the structures were properly entombed rather than damaged through careless filling. This is effort invested in ending something, which suggests that the ending itself held meaning. One possibility is that the burial was protective, an act of preservation rather than destruction. If the beliefs or practices associated with Göbekli Tepe were being replaced by new beliefs, the old structures might have been seen as dangerous if left exposed. Burying them neutralizes any threat they might pose while also preserving them in case they might be needed again. This interpretation sees the burial as precautionary, motivated by uncertainty about whether the change from old to new beliefs was permanent. Another interpretation suggests ritual decommissioning. Many religious traditions have practices for desacralizing spaces that will no longer serve sacred functions. If Göbekli Tepe was sacred, ending its use might have required specific rituals, including physical transformation of the space. Burial transforms the site completely, marking a definitive ending to its active religious life. The buried structures become memory, become ancestors themselves in a sense, honoured through preservation but removed from active use. There's also the possibility of changing cosmologies. If the worldview that made Göbekli Tepe meaningful shifted fundamentally, the site might have become irrelevant or even problematic from the perspective of new beliefs. Rather than destroy it outright, which might risk offending the spiritual entities or ancestors associated with it, burial offers a middle path. The site is ended but not destroyed, set aside but not desecrated. The timing of the burial coincides, roughly, with broader changes in the region. Early agriculture was becoming more established. Permanent villages were appearing. Social structures were evolving. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle that created Göbekli Tepe was giving way to farming communities with different needs, different organisation, different relationships to the land. The site that served hunter-gatherer gathering might not serve agricultural village life in the same way. What's particularly poignant about the burial is its finality combined with its preservation. By filling in the stone circles, the people who did this work ensured that they and their descendants would not see what their ancestors had built. The magnificent carvings, the massive pillars, the carefully crafted terrazzo floors, all were hidden from view, removed from human experience. This suggests that whatever motivated the burial was powerful enough to justify losing direct access to what must have been awe-inspiring architecture. Yet the burial also created the conditions that allowed Göbekli Tepe to survive to be discovered in our time. If the site had remained exposed, wind and rain and human activity would have degraded it over 11,000 years. Stone can endure, but carved details are vulnerable to erosion. By burying the structures, the ancients inadvertently preserved them, created a time capsule that would eventually reveal their achievements to people in a distant future they could not have imagined. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe represents something profound about human relationship to the sacred and to the past. These people created something they valued enormously, maintained it across generations, and then chose to end it, to hide it, to transform it from a living centre of ritual activity into a buried memory. The decision must have been difficult. It must have involved conflict, debate, resistance from those who wanted to maintain the old ways. But the burial happened, the site was ended, and that ending is part of its story as much as its creation and use. Among the animal carvings and anthropomorphic pillars at Göbekli Tepe are abstract symbols whose meaning remains opaque despite decades of study. Our H shapes, C shapes, V shapes, circles, and various geometric forms appear carved into stone surfaces. These symbols are clearly intentional, carefully executed, positioned deliberately. But what they meant to the people who carved them is a question we can only approach through speculation informed by comparison and context. The H-shaped symbols are among the most prominent abstract carvings at the site. They appear on multiple pillars, sometimes in series, sometimes isolated. The shape is simple but distinctive. Two vertical lines connected by a horizontal crossbar. Some researchers have suggested these might represent human figures in highly schematic form, similar to how children's drawings reduce humans to stick figures. Others propose they might be architectural symbols, representing structures or enclosures. Still others see them as purely decorative elements, patterns chosen for aesthetic rather than symbolic reasons. The truth is, we don't know. We can't know with the evidence available. These symbols might have been writing, the earliest we've ever found, recording information in a code we can't crack because we don't have enough examples or context. They might have been ownership marks, identifying which community or clan contributed particular pillars or was responsible for their maintenance. They might have been sacred symbols, representations of spiritual concepts or deities that made sense within the belief system of the builders, but which are completely foreign to us. V-shapes and C-shapes appear alongside the H symbols. These might be parts of a symbolic system, a vocabulary of forms that together communicated meaning. Or they might be unrelated elements, added at different times by different carvers for different purposes. Without written records or oral traditions connecting these symbols to specific meanings, interpretation remains guesswork no matter how educated. Some symbols appear to be tallies or counts, simple marks in series, possibly recording numbers or tracking some quantity. If these are numerical notations, they might relate to calendrical observations, tracking lunar cycles or seasonal changes. They might record ceremonial occasions, a mark added each time the community gathered. They might count offerings made, animals sacrificed, rituals performed. The possibilities are numerous and not mutually exclusive. Comparing Göbekli Tepe's symbols to those from other prehistoric sites reveals both similarities and differences. Abstract symbols appear at many early sites, suggesting that symbolic representation was widespread in prehistory. But each site has its own repertoire of symbols, its own conventions and preferences. This diversity suggests local variation in symbolic systems rather than a universal prehistoric language. Communities developed their own ways of representing ideas visually, much as they developed their own languages for representing ideas verbally. The act of carving symbols into permanent stone elevates them beyond casual notation. These weren't temporary marks scratched in sand or drawn with charcoal on hide. These were symbols meant to endure, carved with effort into stone that would last centuries. This permanence suggests the symbols held significant meaning, that recording them in stone mattered to the carvers and their communities. But we should be careful not to overinterpret. Not every symbol needs to carry deep meaning. Some might be practice carvings, apprentice sculptors learning their craft. Some might be later additions, people visiting the site and adding their own marks for reasons we can't reconstruct. Some might be purely decorative, chosen because the carver liked how they looked, rather than because they meant anything specific. What the symbols do tell us, regardless of their specific meanings, is that the people of Göbekli Tepe were engaged in abstract thought. They were capable of representing ideas visually, of understanding that marks on stone could stand for something beyond themselves. This capacity for symbolic representation is fundamental to human cognition, prerequisite to language, art, mathematics, and all forms of abstract reasoning. The symbols at Göbekli Tepe are messages from the past, but messages in a language we don't speak and perhaps can never fully learn. They remind us that much of past human experience is irretrievably lost, that material remains can only tell us so much about lived experience and belief. They invite speculation while resisting definitive interpretation, and perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some aspects of Göbekli Tepe should remain mysterious, preserving the sense that we're glimpsing something profound but only partially comprehensible, looking across a gulf too wide for complete understanding. Let's approach a bigger question now, one that Göbekli Tepe raises by its very existence. What does this site tell us about human consciousness, about the cognitive and spiritual capacities of people living 11,000 years ago? The traditional view held that human consciousness itself evolved culturally, that people in the deep past thought differently than we do, that abstract reasoning and symbolic thought developed gradually as culture became more complex. Göbekli Tepe challenges this view fundamentally. The people who built this site were clearly capable of abstract thought. They conceived of a massive construction project and executed it across generations. They planned structures before building them, held mental images of desired outcomes and worked to achieve those images. They created symbolic representations of animals and abstract concepts. They organized complex social cooperation. These are not the cognitive achievements of people thinking in fundamentally different ways than we do. The archaeological record increasingly supports what we might call cognitive continuity. Humans with modern brain anatomy had modern cognitive capacity. Our ancestors 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, had brains and minds capable of everything we can do. What changed over time wasn't mental capacity, but accumulated knowledge, technology, and cultural complexity. Each generation built on what previous generations had learned, creating an ever-expanding pool of skills and understanding. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that this cognitive capacity could express itself in sophisticated ways, even without the trappings of what we call civilization. Without writing, without cities, without metal tools. People were creating architecture that required geometric understanding, engineering intuition, aesthetic judgment, and long-term planning. They were creating art that captured observed reality and transformed it through symbolic representation. They were developing religious or cosmological systems complex enough to motivate enormous communal investment. The spiritual dimension of human consciousness is particularly evident at Göbekli Tepe. This was a sacred space. Whatever specific beliefs made it sacred, the people who created it were asking big questions about existence, meaning, their place in the world. They were not content with merely surviving, with meeting immediate material needs. They were driven to create something that transcended the practical, that addressed needs of spirit and community that are as fundamentally human as needs for food and shelter. This spiritual capacity is not learned or culturally transmitted in the way technical knowledge is. It seems to be intrinsic to human consciousness, appearing in all cultures at all times. The capacity for wonder, for recognizing beauty, for feeling awe at the natural world, for seeking meaning beyond material existence. These are human universals. Göbekli Tepe shows these capacities in action 11,000 years ago, functioning at levels of sophistication we associate with much later periods. What might the builders of Göbekli Tepe have wondered about? They would have observed the same natural phenomena we observe, the sun's daily arc across the sky, the moon's changing phases, the wheeling stars, the turning seasons. They would have wondered where the sun goes at night, why the moon changes shape, what stars are. They would have created explanations, myths and stories that made sense of observed patterns and gave meaning to natural cycles. They would have confronted the same existential questions we confront. Why do we exist? What happens when we die? How should we live? What obligations do we have to each other? How do we maintain harmony with the natural world we depend on? Different cultures develop different answers to these questions. But the questions themselves seem universal. Göbekli Tepe represents one community's way of addressing these questions, of creating a space where they could be contemplated collectively. The site also speaks to the human capacity for imagination and aesthetic appreciation. The people who designed Göbekli Tepe made choices not dictated by pure function. They could have created simpler structures that served practical ritual purposes. Instead, they created something beautiful, something that would inspire awe and wonder. They cared how it looked, how it felt to be inside the stone circles, how the carved animals caught light and shadow. This aesthetic sensibility is distinctively human. Göbekli Tepe invites us to see our prehistoric ancestors not as primitive, slowly developing human consciousness, but as fully human people living in different circumstances with different knowledge, but the same fundamental mental and spiritual capacities we possess. They loved and feared and wondered and questioned. They created and dreamed and hoped and mourned. They were us, separated by time and culture, but united by shared humanity. And recognizing this shared humanity across the chasm of 11,000 years creates a connection that is itself profound, a recognition that we are part of a continuity, extending back to the very origins of what we call civilization. Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Since its discovery and initial excavation, archaeologists have identified other similar sites in southeastern Turkey and northern Syria. These discoveries are transforming our understanding of the pre-Pottery Neolithic period, revealing a landscape dotted with monumental structures, a region where multiple communities were engaged in ambitious building projects more or less simultaneously. Let's explore these other sites gently, understanding how they relate to Göbekli Tepe and what they tell us about this remarkable period in human history. Karahan Tepe, located about 60 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, has been known since the 1990s but has only recently been extensively excavated. Like Göbekli Tepe, it contains T-shaped pillars and stone structures dating to the pre-Pottery Neolithic. Some structures at Karahan Tepe are carved into bedrock rather than built as freestanding circles. The site shows similar artistic sophistication, with carved human faces and animal figures. Recent excavations have revealed structures with carved pillars, showing human figures with carefully detailed faces and hands. Navali Chori, discovered during dam construction in the 1980s, predates Göbekli Tepe's excavation as a known site of this type. It's now submerged beneath a reservoir, but before flooding, archaeologists excavated structures with T-shaped pillars, carved stone sculptures, and evidence of ritual activity. Navali Chori demonstrated that Göbekli Tepe was not unique, that the tradition of building stone monuments existed across the region during this period. Harbutsuvan Tepesi, another site identified more recently, shows similar characteristics. T-shaped pillars, stone architecture, and evidence of communal gathering and feasting. The pattern repeats across multiple sites, suggesting a shared cultural tradition or related belief systems extending across southeastern Anatolia. These communities were in contact with each other, sharing ideas and probably participating in each other's ritual cycles. Tel Karamel in northern Syria contains structures that might predate Göbekli Tepe, pushing the origins of this tradition back even earlier than currently recognized. The site contains what appear to be tower structures with possible ritual functions. While different in form from the stone circles at Göbekli Tepe, they show that monumental construction in this region has deep roots, extending back into the late Paleolithic period. What unites these sites is their timing and their purpose. They were all created during the transition from mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle to settled agricultural villages. They all show evidence of serving ritual or ceremonial functions rather than domestic habitation. They all required significant labour investment and communal cooperation. Together, they paint a picture of a region undergoing profound transformation, where communities were experimenting with new forms of social organisation and religious expression. The existence of multiple similar sites raises interesting questions about relationships between them. Were they created by the same communities moving from place to place? Were they built by different communities sharing a common cultural tradition? Were they competing centres, each community building its own ritual site to assert identity and independence? Or were they complementary, parts of a larger pilgrimage circuit where people might visit multiple sites throughout the year? The sites show both similarities and differences. All have T-shaped pillars, but the arrangements vary. All have carved imagery, but the specific animals and symbols chosen differ somewhat from site to site. These variations suggest local expression within a broader shared tradition, communities adapting a common architectural language to their own specific needs and beliefs. As excavation continues at these sites and as surveys identify additional locations with similar characteristics, our picture of the pre-pottery Neolithic becomes richer and more complex. This wasn't a period of isolated communities struggling at the margins of survival. It was a time of cultural flourishing, of experimentation with new social forms, of widespread engagement in monumental construction and artistic creation. It was a threshold moment in human history, and we're only beginning to understand its full scope and significance. These other sites help contextualize Göbekli Tepe. What seemed like an isolated anomaly now appears as the most thoroughly excavated example of a widespread phenomenon. Göbekli Tepe might be the largest or the oldest of these sites, or it might simply be the one that has received the most archaeological attention. Regardless of its specific status among these monuments, its significance remains. It represents a moment when humans were becoming something new, when the social and cultural foundations were being laid for everything that would follow. And understanding what follows, what Göbekli Tepe's legacy is, and how it transforms our broader understanding of human development, becomes the focus of our continuing exploration. For more than a century, archaeologists and historians taught a consistent narrative about how civilization began. The story was straightforward and logical. Humans were hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years, living in small mobile bands, surviving through knowledge of wild plants and animals. About 10,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, people began domesticating plants and animals, creating agriculture. Agriculture allowed food surpluses. Surpluses freed some people from food production to specialize as craftspeople, warriors, and priests. Social hierarchy developed. Villages grew into towns and towns into cities. Writing was invented. Organized religion created temples. Civilization had arrived. This narrative placed agriculture at the beginning of everything. Farming was the spark that ignited the complex sequence of developments leading from Stone Age savagery to Bronze Age civilization. The progression was presented as natural, almost inevitable. A ladder that human societies climbed rung by rung. Archaeological evidence was interpreted to fit this framework, and exceptions were treated as anomalies, outliers that didn't challenge the broader pattern. Göbekli Tepe disrupts this narrative fundamentally. It demonstrates that monumental architecture predated agriculture, that complex social organization predated settled villages, that sophisticated religious expression predated specialized priest classes. The ladder metaphor breaks down. Development wasn't a simple linear progression, but a more complex process with multiple parallel developments, feedback loops, and contingencies. The implications ripple through our understanding of prehistory. If agriculture wasn't the prerequisite for monumental architecture, what was? What motivated hunter-gatherers to invest enormous effort in creating Göbekli Tepe? The answer seems to be social and spiritual rather than material. People built Göbekli Tepe because they wanted to gather, because they shared beliefs that made such gathering meaningful, because creating something permanent together had value, independent of practical utility. This realization shifts our understanding of what drives cultural change. Economic determinism, the idea that material conditions determine cultural development, becomes less convincing. Humans are not simply rational actors responding to environmental pressures and opportunities. We're also meaning-seeking beings, driven by beliefs and values and social bonds that can motivate action, independent of material benefit. Göbekli Tepe is evidence of this deeper motivation, of religion or spirituality or communal identity, as drivers of change in their own right. Some archaeologists now propose that the causal arrow might run in the opposite direction from the traditional narrative. Instead of agriculture enabling monument building might have encouraged agricultural development. The need to feed large gatherings at sites like Göbekli Tepe could have motivated efforts to increase food production through cultivation and animal management. The social structures developed to organize construction could have been adapted to organize agricultural labor. The values of permanence and investment in place that motivated building could have encouraged settling down to 10 crops. This revision doesn't mean agriculture was unimportant. It remains one of the most consequential developments in human history, fundamentally transforming how we live and organize ourselves. But it means we need to understand agriculture as emerging from complex social and cultural context rather than appearing spontaneously, and then driving all subsequent change. Human development is messier than the traditional narrative suggests, more contingent, more influenced by factors beyond simple subsistence needs. Göbekli Tepe has also changed how we think about the cognitive capacities of prehistoric peoples. The traditional narrative often implied that human intelligence or consciousness itself evolved culturally, that people in the distant past thought in simpler or more primitive ways. But the sophisticated planning, the geometric understanding, the artistic skill, and the abstract symbolic thought demonstrated at Göbekli Tepe all require fully modern cognition. These weren't people developing human consciousness. These were people who had human consciousness in full and were using it to create something remarkable. The rewriting extends beyond prehistory to how we understand what civilization means. If civilization is defined by cities, writing, centralized government, and class stratification, then Göbekli Tepe precedes civilization by thousands of years. But if civilization means the capacity to create monumental architecture, to organize complex social cooperation, to invest in things beyond immediate material needs, then Göbekli Tepe represents an early form of civilization. One that develops differently than the urban civilizations that followed, but which nonetheless deserves recognition as a sophisticated cultural achievement. This rewriting is ongoing. Each excavation season at Göbekli Tepe and related sites produces new information. New analytical techniques applied to existing evidence reveal patterns previously missed, and archaeologists and anthropologists continue to debate how best to interpret what's been found. What it means for our understanding of human history. The story is still being written, or rather rewritten, and will probably continue to be revised as our understanding deepens, but the central insight remains. Göbekli Tepe represents something unexpected and profound, a challenge to assumptions we held with confidence, a reminder that the past is always more complex and surprising than we imagine. When we consider what remains of Göbekli Tepe, we must also contemplate what's been lost. Archaeology recovers only a fraction of past material culture, and material culture itself is only a fraction of lived experience. Most of what mattered to the builders of Göbekli Tepe has vanished completely, leaving only the stone to tell its incomplete story. Let's consider gently what we can never know. All organic materials have decomposed. Wood used for levers and scaffolding, for tools and containers, for fuel, for temporary structures, all gone. Leather from clothing, bags, shelters, drumheads, all disintegrated. Plant fibres woven into cordage, basketry, textiles, all reduced to nothing by time and microbial action. The stone endures, but wood and hide and fibre, which probably comprise the majority of material objects these people made, have left no trace. The perishable elements of the site's decoration are lost. Göbekli Tepe might have been brilliantly coloured, painted with pigments derived from ochre, charcoal and plant materials. The stone pillars might have borne designs we can't see because the paint has flaked away over millennia. Textiles might have hung between pillars, creating privacy or decoration. Flowers might have been strewn on floors during ceremonies. All of this colour and texture and beauty has faded into soil, leaving only pale limestone for us to see. The soundscape of Göbekli Tepe is utterly lost. We can never hear the music that accompanied rituals, the drums beating rhythms, the flutes carrying melodies, the voices raised in song or chant. We don't know what their music sounded like, what emotional registers it explored, what meanings it carried. Silence now where there was once sound and rhythm and collective vocalization that bound participants together in shared experience. Language has vanished completely. Whatever tongue or tongues these people spoke, they left no written record. And the languages evolved and changed and split and merged until any connection to modern languages is impossible to trace. We can never know their word for their temple, their name for the place we call Göbekli Tepe. We can't know the myths they told, the prayers they spoke, the songs they sang. The most distinctly human capacity, language, has left no recoverable trace. Personal identity is lost. We don't know anyone's name from this period and place. No individual person can be identified, no biography reconstructed. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were individuals with personalities, preferences, talents, relationships. They had names and nicknames. They had friends and rivals. They experienced joy and sorrow, success and failure. But all of this individual experience has dissolved into the collective anonymity of prehistory. Social structures and political organization can only be guessed at. How were decisions made about the site's construction and use? Who had authority? How was that authority legitimated? Were there chiefs or councils? Were communities egalitarian or hierarchical? These questions can't be answered definitively from material remains alone. The social fabric that held these communities together, the networks of obligation and reciprocity and power, all of this is invisible to archaeology. Beliefs and cosmology are opaque. We know Göbekli Tepe was important to its builders, that it served ritual purposes, that animals had symbolic significance. But the actual belief system, the myths and explanations and divine beings or forces, the whole structure of meaning that made the site sacred, this is lost beyond recovery. We can speculate, can propose possibilities based on comparison with other cultures, but we can never know with certainty what they believed or why. The phenomenology of experience is inaccessible. What did it feel like to enter one of the stone circles during a ceremony? What emotions did the space evoke? What was it like to see the carved pillars for the first time, to participate in a feast, to hear music echoing off stone walls? Subjective experience leaves no archaeological signature. We can stand in the excavated circles now, but we stand as outsiders, tourists from an unimaginably different world, and cannot access the experience as insiders knew it. Even among what does survive, much is still buried. Only a fraction of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar suggests many more structures remain beneath the surface. Future excavations might reveal elements that change our understanding again. What we know is limited not just by what's been lost, but by what hasn't yet been found. This recognition of loss need not be discouraging. It can instead cultivate humility, an appropriate appreciation for the limits of our knowledge, and the vastness of what remains unknowable. The past peoples had lives as rich and complex as ours, experiences as meaningful, beliefs as sophisticated. That most of this is lost doesn't diminish its reality or importance. It simply means we're seeing fragments, shadows, echoes. But even fragments can be illuminating. Even shadows can reveal form. Even echoes can carry meaning. And what we've learned from the stones of Göbekli Tepe, incomplete as that knowledge is, has already transformed our understanding of human history. Despite decades of excavation and study, Göbekli Tepe retains its mysteries. Some questions may never be answered definitively, but asking them helps us appreciate the depth of what we don't know and the challenges inherent in interpreting the distant past. Let's consider these open questions not as frustrations, but as invitations to wonder, to imagine, to recognize the limits of certainty while respecting what can be known. Why did they bury it? This question returns us to one of the site's most puzzling features. The deliberate burial required significant effort. The people who did this work chose to hide what their ancestors had built, to end Göbekli Tepe's function as an active ritual site. Proposed explanations include changing beliefs, protective preservation, ritual decommissioning, and cultural transformation accompanying agricultural intensification. Each explanation is plausible, none can be proven. The question remains open, inviting continued speculation and debate. How did they organise the labour? Moving 20-ton stones without draft animals or wheeled vehicles required coordinating many people. How was this coordination achieved? Who made decisions about construction? How were different communities' contributions recognised and managed? Was participation voluntary or coerced? These questions about social organisation and authority structures can't be answered from archaeological remains alone. We see the results of organisation, but not the organisational mechanisms themselves. What did the symbols mean? The abstract carvings, the H shapes and V shapes and geometric forms clearly meant something to their creators. But what? Were they writing, numbers, sacred symbols, ownership marks, decorative elements? Without a Rosetta Stone providing translation or enough examples to enable pattern recognition, interpretation remains speculative. The symbols continue to guard their meanings across the gulf of millennia. Who are buried here, if anyone? Some researchers have suggested that Göbekli Tepe might have served funerary functions, perhaps as a place for sky burial or excarnation. But human remains found at the site are fragmentary and minimal, not definitively indicating funerary practices. Were people buried here? If so, who and why? If not, how did these communities dispose of their dead? The question of death ritual remains largely unanswered. What was the relationship to domestication? The timing of Göbekli Tepe coincides with the earliest evidence for plant and animal domestication in the region. Is this coincidence or connection? Did gatherings at sites like Göbekli Tepe contribute to domestication by concentrating populations and creating incentives for food production? Or did early agriculture enable the site's construction? The causal relationships remain unclear, probably because they were complex and reciprocal, rather than simple and unidirectional. How many people visited? During peak gatherings, how many people came to Göbekli Tepe? Estimates range from dozens to hundreds to possibly thousands, but firm numbers are impossible to establish. The question matters because it affects our understanding of the site's regional importance and the scale of social cooperation it represents. A gathering of hundreds would have different social dynamics and logistical challenges than a gathering of thousands. What happened during rituals? The most vivid aspect of Göbekli Tepe's active life is also the most opaque. We know gatherings occurred, feasts happened, rituals were performed. But the content of those rituals, the words spoken and songs sung, the actions performed, the meanings invoked, all of this is invisible to archaeology. We can only imagine, and our imaginations are constrained by the vast differences between their world and ours. Were there similar sites that haven't survived? Göbekli Tepe and the related sites we know about were built in stone, which endures. But perhaps other communities built similar structures in wood, in clay, in materials that decay. How many Göbekli Tepes might have existed across the landscape, serving similar functions for communities that chose or were limited to using perishable materials? We'll never know, because only stone survives to tell us what was. What would the builders think of our interpretation? This question is perhaps the most humbling. If we could somehow explain to the people who built Göbekli Tepe what we think about their creation, would they recognise our interpretation as valid? Would they laugh at our misunderstandings? Would they be frustrated by what we've missed? Our interpretations are inevitably shaped by our own cultural assumptions, our categories of thought, our ways of understanding religion and society. The builders had their own categories, now lost, and we can never be certain that our interpretations map accurately onto their intentions and meanings. These questions, unanswerable yet important. Remind us that history and prehistory are not simple narratives waiting to be uncovered, but complex reconstructions, always partial and provisional. Every interpretation rests on assumptions, on educated guesses, on arguments from analogy and comparison. Being honest about this uncertainty, about the limits of what can be known, is part of respecting both the evidence and the people who left it. Göbekli Tepe teaches us as much through its mysteries as through its revelations, as much through what remains unknown as through what we've learned. Imagine, if you will, visiting Göbekli Tepe today. You approach the site across the Anatolian plateau, the landscape semi-arid, dotted with fields and scattered settlements. The modern town of Şanlıurfa lies nearby, its history extending back millennia, but its current form completely different from the landscape the builders of Göbekli Tepe knew. You arrive at the archaeological site, now protected and partially reconstructed, with walkways and explanatory signs, a museum and facilities for visitors. You descend into the excavated areas, where protective canopies shield the ancient stones from weather. And suddenly, there they are, the T-shaped pillars rising from their circles, limestone pale and solid, carved with animals whose species you recognize: lions, foxes, snakes, birds. The same species, more or less, that inhabited this landscape 11,000 years ago, and in some cases still inhabit it today. The carving is sophisticated, unmistakably intentional, clearly the work of skilled and patient hands. Standing in one of the stone circles, you can orient yourself by the central pillars. They rise taller than you, massive presences that dominate the space. You can touch them if allowed, feel the cool stone, trace with your fingers the carved reliefs. These stones were shaped by human hands using flint tools. They were moved and erected by human muscle and ingenuity. They stood here through the entirety of recorded history, buried but enduring, waiting to be found again. Looking around the circle, you see the perimeter pillars, smaller but still substantial, creating the sense of enclosure that defines the space. The floors, now exposed by excavation, show the terrazzo work, limestone chips still visible in the ancient matrix. Someone mixed that mortar, laid those chips, polished the surface smooth. The work was careful, attentive, done by people who cared about the result. You try to imagine the space as it was when active. No protective canopy overhead, but open to sky, or perhaps covered with temporary structures of wood and hide. Not empty and silent as now, but full of people gathered from across the region. Fires burning, cooking meat, providing light as daylight fades. Voices speaking languages that will never be heard again. Music on instruments that have long since returned to dust. The sun sets over the plateau as it has set over this place for billions of years. It set here long before life existed on Earth, before humans evolved, before anyone stood here and watched it descend toward the horizon. It set here while Göbekli Tepe was being built, its light falling on workers raising stones and carving animals. It set here after the site was buried, its rays touching only grass and soil with no hint of what lay beneath, and it sets now with you standing in the excavated circle, a visitor from a world the builders could never have imagined. There's something deeply moving about standing in a place where people gathered 11,000 years ago. The connection across time is almost tangible. These same stones, these same positions in space, witnessed human activity when mammoths still roamed other parts of the world, when the pyramids of Egypt were still 8,000 years in the future, when writing didn't exist and all human knowledge was carried in memory and expressed through speech and demonstration. The people who built this place were not alien. They were humans, like you, with the same fundamental needs and capacities. They loved their children and mourned their dead. They wondered about existence and sought meaning in ritual and community. They created beauty, not for utility, but because beauty matters to humans, because we're aesthetic beings who care how things look and feel. They cooperated across communities to achieve shared goals, overcoming the suspicions and conflicts that could divide them. Standing here, you're standing where they stood. Your feet occupy space their feet occupied. Your eyes see stones their eyes saw, though now excavated from the burial they imposed. Your mind contemplates what theirs contemplated, though across a gulf of time and culture that makes true understanding impossible. But the effort to understand, the reaching across that gulf, is itself meaningful. It connects you to the human story, to the long arc of cultural development that brought you to this moment. You're part of a continuity. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were part of a chain of human existence extending back to our species' origins in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. You're part of that same chain, connected through unbroken lineages of descent to those ancient Anatolian builders and to all the humans who came before them. What they started in some metaphorical sense, you continue. Their capacity for wonder, for creativity, for cooperation, for seeking meaning, these live in you because you share their humanity. As darkness settles over the site, as modern lights illuminate the ancient stones in ways their builders never saw, you leave the excavation area. Return to the contemporary world with its cars and phones and electric lights. But something stays with you. A sense of connection, of perspective, of understanding how recent and contingent our modern world is, and how deep the roots of humanity extend. Göbekli Tepe offers this gift to its visitors, a glimpse into deep time, a recognition of human continuity, a reminder that we're part of something larger and older than ourselves. In the end, what is Göbekli Tepe? It's many things, accumulating meanings as we've explored it together over these hours. It's an archaeological site, a concentration of human-modified stones and artifacts that provides evidence of past activity. It's a monument, a deliberate creation meant to endure and impress. It's a temple, a sacred space where rituals occurred and communities gathered to connect with whatever they understood as divine or transcendent. But perhaps most fundamentally, Göbekli Tepe is humanity's first known attempt to create a permanent sacred space, and that primacy carries profound significance. Before Göbekli Tepe, as far as we currently know, human religion was portable. It occurred wherever communities gathered, marked perhaps by temporary altars or arrangements of natural features, but not requiring permanent architecture. The sacred was immanent, present in landscape and practice rather than localized in built structures. Göbekli Tepe represents a change in this relationship, a decision to create a place that would be sacred, that would concentrate spiritual energy or attention or meaning. This decision to build permanent sacred architecture speaks to changing human consciousness and social organization. It implies a relationship to place different from nomadic patterns. It suggests that the location itself, this particular hilltop in Anatolia, had significance worth marking with monumental construction. Whether that significance came from natural features, from cosmological beliefs about the spot, from practical considerations of centrality to multiple communities' territories, or from some combination we can't fully reconstruct, the builders chose this place and invested it with meaning through their construction. The permanence itself is significant. Building in stone, creating something meant to outlast individual lives and even generations, represents thinking about time differently. It's investing in the future, creating for people who don't yet exist. It's also honouring the past, ensuring that efforts of previous generations aren't lost, but continue to have presence and influence. This temporal consciousness, this thinking across generations, is distinctively human and becomes more pronounced as societies develop institutions and material culture intended to endure. Göbekli Tepe as the first sacred space also represents the beginning of a tradition that continues to our time. Every temple, church, mosque, synagogue, shrine, or sacred grove that exists in the world today is part of a lineage that extends back to this impulse to create places set apart for spiritual purposes. The specific beliefs and practices have changed enormously. The architectural forms have evolved through thousands of iterations. but the fundamental idea that certain spaces should be dedicated to the sacred, designated for ritual and contemplation and connection with transcendent meaning, this idea traces back to decisions made by people like those who built Göbekli Tepe. Understanding Göbekli Tepe as the first sacred space helps us understand religion itself differently. Religious impulses weren't consequences of agricultural surplus or social hierarchy, or ruling classes needing to legitimate their power. Religion, in the broad sense of seeking transcendent meaning and expressing that seeking through collective ritual, was present in humans before we settled into villages, before we developed complex social stratification, before we created writing or cities or empires. Religious or spiritual seeking appears to be fundamental to humanity. Not a superstructure built on material foundations, but a foundation in its own right. This perspective doesn't validate any particular religious tradition's truth claims. It doesn't tell us whether gods exist or which cosmological system correctly describes ultimate reality. What it does tell us is that humans have been asking these questions, seeking these connections, creating these meanings for at least 11,000 years and probably far longer. The capacity for spiritual seeking is as old as our species and has been powerful enough to motivate remarkable achievements like Göbekli Tepe. The builders of Göbekli Tepe created the first sacred space we know of, but they weren't inventing religion. They were expressing through architecture what humans had probably felt and practiced, in less permanent forms for millennia before. They were taking an existing impulse and giving it monumental form, making the intangible tangible, the temporary permanent. In doing so, they created something that would outlast their own time by thousands of years, that would eventually speak to us across that enormous gulf, that would transform our understanding of who they were and what they were capable of achieving. Göbekli Tepe sits at a threshold. Behind it, in time, lies the long Paleolithic period when humans lived as mobile hunter-gatherers, our lifestyle for the vast majority of our species' existence. Ahead of it lies the Neolithic Revolution, the development of agriculture and settled villages and eventually cities and states and civilizations. Göbekli Tepe belongs to neither world fully. It's built by hunter-gatherers, but represents organizational complexity we associate with agricultural societies. It's created by people still living close to nature, but marks a step toward transforming and controlling that nature. This threshold position makes Göbekli Tepe particularly valuable for understanding human development. It shows us a moment of transition, captures in stone a society in the process of becoming something new, and it reminds us that transitions are gradual, complex, involving many parallel changes rather than single defining moments. The shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture took thousands of years. Göbekli Tepe exists within that long transition, both product of and contributor to the changes transforming human existence. As we prepare to conclude our exploration, let Göbekli Tepe stand in your mind as what it is, a remarkable achievement by remarkable people, a gift across time from ancestors who shared our humanity but lived in worlds we can barely imagine. They created this place with effort and skill and vision. They used it for purposes that mattered deeply to them. They buried it carefully, perhaps never imagining it would be found again, and it waits still, mostly unexcavated, holding more secrets, ready to teach us more about who we were and are and might become. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey into the past. We've travelled together across 11,000 years, back to a hilltop in Anatolia, where people not so different from us built something extraordinary. From that shepherd's discovery in 1963 to Klaus Schmidt's recognition of what lay beneath the surface, from the excavation of massive T-shaped pillars to the patient interpretation of carved symbols, from questions about hunter-gatherers building temples to mysteries about why they chose to bury what they'd created. We've explored Göbekli Tepe from many angles, always gently, always with respect for both the evidence and the limits of our understanding. The answer to the question we began with, what Göbekli Tepe tells us about our ancestors and ourselves, is complex and still developing. As honestly as I can give it, The answer is this. Göbekli Tepe tells us that humans 11,000 years ago were capable of sophisticated abstract thought, complex social organization, remarkable artistic achievement, and profound spiritual seeking. They built not because they had to for survival, but because they chose to for meaning. They invested enormous effort in creating sacred space, because spiritual needs mattered to them as much as material needs. And they did all this before settling into agricultural villages, challenging our assumptions about how civilization develops and what motivates human cultural change. If you enjoyed this slow drift through archaeology and ancient mystery, I'd be grateful if you'd leave a like and consider subscribing for more calm explorations of history. Comments about what resonated with you or what you'd like to explore next are always welcome. And to those already part of this community, thank you for being here, for sharing these quiet hours of discovery and contemplation. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you're comfortable. I hope your breathing has slowed into the rhythm of approaching sleep. I hope your thoughts have quieted, their urgent edges softened by our time together. I hope your body feels heavy and warm, ready to release the day and drift into rest. You've given these hours to learning about people long dead and their remarkable creation. That's a gift to yourself, expanding your understanding, connecting you to human history's deep roots. Look up at the stars if you can see them from where you are, or imagine them if walls or clouds obstruct the view. Those same stars shone over Göbekli Tepe when it was being built, their light taking thousands of years to reach Earth, crossing the cosmic distance to illuminate human efforts at meaning-making. The people who carved those limestone pillars looked up at these same stars and wondered, as we wonder, what they are and what they mean. That shared wonder connects us across the chasm of millennia, reminds us that for all our technological development and cultural change, we're asking the same essential questions about existence and meaning that humans have always asked. Perhaps the deepest gift Göbekli Tepe offers us is perspective. Our modern world, with its cities and technologies and complexities, is recent, contingent, built on foundations laid by people like those who gathered on that Anatolian hilltop. They made choices that shape possibilities for everyone who came after. We make choices now that will shape possibilities for those who come after us. We're part of a continuity, temporary stewards of a human story that extends far before us and will continue far beyond us. And understanding that continuity, feeling our connection to it, can bring a kind of peace, a recognition that our individual concerns exist within something much larger and more enduring. Sleep well tonight. Dream, if you dream, of ancient gatherings under open sky, of carved animals frozen in stone, of communities coming together to create something meant to outlast them. Dream of limestone pillars standing through centuries of burial, waiting patiently to be found. Dream of human capacity for wonder, for creativity, for cooperation across differences, for seeking meaning in a mysterious universe. Dream of connection across time, of standing where others stood, of sharing humanity with people separated from us by unimaginable gulfs, but united with us in essential ways. Good night. Thank you for this time together. Thank you for your curiosity, your patience, your willingness to explore slowly and carefully. May your rest be deep and restorative. May you wake refreshed, carrying with you some sense of connection to the long human story of which you're part. Sweet dreams, peaceful sleep, and until we meet again in another exploration of history's quiet wonders, take care of yourself. Good night.